Hi, and welcome to another edition of Asia Gaming Brief's Face-to-Face series. Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Anastasia Hronis. Anastasia is a clinical psychologist and founder of the Australian Institute for Human Wellness. She's also an honorary associate at the University of Technology, Sydney, and she's an expert on mental health and addiction disorders, and she also works with a number of casinos on their RG training initiatives. I'm going to be talking to Anastasia today about the social stigma that comes with gambling and gambling addiction, particularly amongst Asian cultures. And I'm hoping that from this we can glean a little bit more about how we can better help the people who are at risk of suffering from gambling harm when we're approaching them on the gaming floor. Anastasia, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I had the pleasure of hearing your presentation last week at the Regulating the Game conference in Sydney, where you talked about the importance of destigmatizing responsible gaming. I guess, first of all, could you explain to us very briefly what's that challenge that you're seeing out there and what has been its consequences?
So, we've made a lot of good progress in recent years when it comes to promoting the message of responsible gaming and responsible gambling. And, many years ago, it was still a concept that we were just still defining and getting a grasp of. What we're finding at the moment is that the term and the concept of responsible gambling is very much tied to and tangled up with the concept of problem gambling. And so what I mean by that is that while we want responsible gambling to be something that people can use to prevent problem gambling harms, what we end up finding is that people actually reject the notion of responsible gambling or don't get on board with strategies in which we might recommend because they think, well, I don't have a problem, so why would I utilize responsible gambling strategies? Why would I put measures in place to limit my, play or limit the amount of time I'm spending playing? I don't have a problem with it. So because we've sort of had this reactive approach to trying to assist those and who have problems with gambling and prevent that sort of harm, responsible gambling has come out as a result of that, and it's become tangled up with that notion. So when I talk about sort of destigmatizing problem gambling and responsible gambling, it's with the aim to untie those two things so that people can get on board with the notion of responsible gambling as just something I do that is a safe way for me to engage with my play without any necessary thinking about problems that I may or may not have. It's actually just a preventative thing or something I can do if I'm someone who might be vulnerable to experiencing harms perhaps in the future.
I recently had a chance to speak with a casino operator about this particular issue, and this casino operator in question deals with a lot of Asian and Chinese VIP gamblers. And what they found is when it comes to trying to have a conversation about responsible play with this group in particular, they're more often than not, they're met with like this defensive or sometimes a combative attitude. And I might be at risk of getting a little bit too much into the social science behind all of this, but why does it happen among certain groups and like where does that all come from?
Yeah. Look, there's certainly certain groups who might be more at risk and certain groups where we know there are higher rates of stigma and shame. And I talk about that not just sort of specific to gambling, but problem gambling is falling underneath that umbrella of mental health. And when we do look at some of the, Asian communities, there is higher shame and stigma that we have found, like the research has shown when it does come to getting assistance for things like gambling problems or mental health and addiction more broadly. So with that added barrier, then having sort of, say, casino staff try and approach a customer is going to be much more difficult because there is that added barrier of stigma and shame.
And where does that stigma come from? It comes from from their culture, from their upbringing. Like, is there a specific thing you can pinpoint and say, well, that's why there's so much stigma amongst this group?
It can be a range of factors. Culture definitely comes into it, that within some cultures, there is certainly that perception of don't share vulnerabilities, don't share if you're struggling with sort of people outside, say the family, the immediate family or the community. So there can definitely be those factors. I think the other factor that comes into it is sort of how normalized is something like gambling and gaming within a particular culture, and views around luck and things like that. That if someone is sort of gambling and winning, that sense of luck is very much tied to their character and person, perhaps more so in some of the Asian cultures than in the Western cultures. So there's probably a number of factors that come into play in terms of looking at potential added barriers there.
And you've helped a lot of staff become better equipped at approaching these people in these situations. So what kind of advice are you giving to them about going over these encounters?
Building rapport is a really key part of it. If we just have staff approach someone who seems to be perhaps struggling with limiting their play, if we just sort of come out of the blue, we're probably going to be more likely to be met with defensiveness. But if there is some sort of relationship and rapport that can be developed, and that might just be having a conversation of, hey, how's it going today? Are you enjoying your day here? Are you having fun gambling? Just starting that initial conversation to build the relationship, that's a really crucial part, because then there's a foundation from which to potentially escalate that conversation to something like, hey, like I'm noticing that it doesn't always seem that fun for you. How can we help?
Yeah, I'm always just thinking, and coming from an Asian background myself, I can understand why there's that perceived feeling of shame or disgrace that could come from really any kind of addiction and not just gambling addiction. I was looking at some data earlier and I thought it was quite interesting and wondering if you have a take on it. The Philippines in the last 8 years has excluded around 1,200 people in total from the country's gaming establishments. And I think that's in Macau, I think that was more like around 3,000 in the last 10 years. Interestingly, in Singapore, I saw as many as 178,000 in just 2020 excluded from casinos. And I'm not sure what the data is in Australia. I think it's difficult to pinpoint because we have so many different self-exclusion programs and across different sectors, different states. But I just wonder what causes that massive discrepancy even amongst some of these Asian jurisdictions.
I think the way in which self-exclusion programs are pitched, for lack of a better way of putting it, is a really important factor here. What does actually excluding yourself from a venue involve? Do you have to go into the venue? Do you have to have your photo taken? Is it that you have to exclude for a period of 12 months? And if you breach that you're facing a quite significant penalty? What's involved in the process? Because at the moment, some processes, I think, in my opinion, probably add to the stigma and shame. It's almost like this sort of, you're a criminal if you're applying for this process. For other self-exclusion programs, it's much easier. You can do it online. It's more accessible. There's more flexibility over how long you self-exclude for. And I think that's really where we need to be moving towards, because, self-exclusion is very much tied in some places to, I have a problem, therefore I need to self-exclude. But again, coming back to, well, maybe I've just had some sort of significant life event occur. I may be feeling a bit vulnerable. Maybe I want to put some sort of, limit on myself for the next few months just to keep myself safe. Don't necessarily need to have a problem, but I'm just safeguarding myself. So I think, self-exclusion programs, we have some work to do there to really look at what's the most effective way of implementing them, and then using that to determine, how many people are actually signing up for them to get the most benefit out of them.
You made a really great analogy last week around the sort of differences and similarities between problem gambling, responsible gaming, and problem drinking and responsible drinking as well. Could you give us a very brief overview of kind of how you see those two coming together?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we've made more progress in the space of drinking and consumption of alcohol, where nowadays it is, particularly in Australia, a common message to hear things like, don't drink and drive. If you are planning to go out and drink, then have a, plan B ride to get home. I know things now, like if I'm going to go out and, consume alcohol, that it's a good idea to eat before I do so, maybe have some water in between drinks, maybe limit it to one standard drink per hour. I know not to drink if I'm trying to fall pregnant. And, none of these things are necessarily things that I might be conscious of or doing because I'm thinking, I'm going to do this because I might have a drinking problem or to prevent developing a drinking problem. I do them because they're safe, responsible strategies for me to put into place if I want to go out, have a good time, and minimize the harmful effects of alcohol. And I think we're yet to catch up with being able to translate that into gambling.
What would be your suggestions to the government or to the industry to put out messages that are going to be a bit more well received?
I think we have to normalize it. Like with drinking, it's been a bit of a slow burn. It's been constant messaging over time, within, messaging within pubs, labels on bottles, campaigns that we see on TV. So similarly with gambling, I think we need to come at it from all directions, but have that consistency of responsible, safe play is normal. It's a good thing to do. You don't need to have a problem to do it. And start to shift the culture and the stigmatism that's attached to those safe play strategies.
I just wanted to round this out. Now, responsible gaming in Asia, it's just, I think, from my perspective as a journalist, it's just not something that gets as much airtime as we have in Australia and possibly in some other jurisdictions of the world. I think Europe actually does a really great job in certain places. But I mean, what work needs to be done amongst Asian jurisdictions to make this more of a normalized conversation, do you think?
I think exactly what you just said, like normalize the conversation, whether it's within casinos to start to normalize that, someone may come up and approach you about your gambling behavior if it does seem to be, in those upper limits of what we would consider harmful or if someone's displaying those sort of risk factors. Whether it's sort of governments and public health campaigns, like we really want to be getting ahead of the curve. So we don't want to just be reactive to people sort of developing problems relating to gambling, but actually get ahead of the curve and look at prevention and preventative strategies and strategies that are appropriate for people who are in that low risk category. And that is going to require, I believe, sort of constant messaging, normalizing the conversation and making it a normal, responsible thing for people to do to assess and reflect on their own gambling behaviors.
Well, thank you very much for your insights today, Anastasia, and it's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you very much.
And that was Dr. Anastasia Hronis, a responsible gaming and mental health expert, talking to us about some of the cultural differences that could have a profound impact on responsible gaming initiatives. Tune in every Friday as we hear from the leading minds in Australia's and Asia's gaming industry.